All right, we are moving on to Unit 2, which we're starting with Chapter 5 here. So this unit is a three-chapter unit, 5, 6, and 7. And this unit is where we're going to go ahead and start getting into our different body systems. So the first we're going to start with is the integumentary system. Some of this should be a little bit of a review from chapter 4 in the tissues chapter, but we'll kind of reintroduce the most important things you need to know that all relate to our integumentary system. So the word integument itself, when we're talking about the integumentary system, really just means covering. And many people think of the skin right away. That's kind of the obvious main organ. But keep in mind, we have other coverings, which we call accessory structures. So something like our hair, our eyelashes, our eyebrows, our nails. And then we're going to talk about some different types of exocrine glands that also are included within the integumentary system. We always like to tie this back to the clinical picture because that's partly why we are learning this anatomy and physiology, so that it helps us as we move on towards our allied health fields. So the integumentary system is a really important diagnostic tool because it's the very first look that you get at your patient or a person. So the appearance of their integumentary system oftentimes can give us a hint about what's going on in the body. For example, someone that is super pale may be experiencing anemia or a lack of red blood cells. Someone who is starting to look a little blue may be oxygen deficient. Someone that has a yellowish look associated with what we call jaundice may have some liver failure. And so while you guys don't necessarily have to memorize all these different colors and what they go with, just understand that this is going to be an important diagnostic tool for us and one of the first things that can give us a hint about what may be going on in some of the other systems of the body. So we always start with our system functions. So you'll see that trend as we continue through our body systems. For the integumentary system itself, one of our big ones is protection. So our skin, our hair, our nails all provide protection. Sensation is another big one. Obviously, stuff like light touch onto our skin, but you can also think of things like pain, temperature, vibration, pressure. All of those different sensations are going to have a receptor that detects them. And most of those, if not all of our different types, we can find within the integumentary system. Vitamin D production is a little less obvious, but this is where it actually starts. So we're going to talk about vitamin D production in a few different systems. It's one that's a bit of a domino effect. There's a few different steps to the pathway to actually activate vitamin D, and the beginning of that pathway is within the skin and the integumentary system. And there's a reason that we have sunshine there because it's actually activated by the UV rays that we receive from the sun. So just having vitamin D within our diet is only so good for us because we need the sun to activate it. Temperature regulation is another one that we'll talk about, and that's also related to our vascular system, where the blood vessels that come near the surface of our skin. And then our last one here, this is or should be a pretty minor role. There's an excretion of waste, so we can actually sweat out. It's not quite the same as sweating out, but we can remove some wastes through our skin. Right, so the skin is kind of our layman's term, but our official name for the skin is the cutaneous membrane. We talked about serous membranes and mucous membranes and synovial membranes in our previous unit, and our cutaneous membrane is really the biggest membrane, and our skin is the biggest organ of the body. And we're going to talk about some of the layers that make up this cutaneous membrane. So our most superficial layer here is the epidermis. You can see we have a lot of layers of very flat cells. So think back to chapter 4 and think how you would name this type of tissue. Our deeper layer, our thickest layer is the dermis, and you can see this is where we have a lot of our different blood vessels, our nerves, and all of our structures that go along with the skin. The skin is made up of only our epidermis and our dermis. We have subcutaneous tissue, which is sometimes known as the hypodermis, and it's really just fatty tissue that's not actually part of our cutaneous membrane. So our top two layers, our epidermis and dermis, are considered the cutaneous membrane. We oftentimes depict this adipose subcutaneous tissue with this, but it's not actually part of our skin. Once we go deeper than the dermis, we're below the skin. So if you said stratified squamous epithelium for how you would name those many layers of flat cells, good job. And these stratified squamous epithelium have a special characteristic that we refer to as keratinized. So some of you may have heard of keratin. It's really a protein that provides some additional strength. It's very common in lotions and drops for your skin and your hair because it helps make it stronger in a sense. And what it does for our epidermis is it helps prevent water loss and provides additional strength and protection. So those keratinized upper cells, and we'll talk about these layers a bit more soon, help kind of form a border or a seal that helps keep things out that shouldn't be there and helps keep things like water in that we want to maintain within our system. So we call these stratified because we have many layers, and it's important that we have many layers in a spot that is going to take a lot of abrasions. If you think we bump our arms and legs and whatever it may be on our tables, if we scratch our skin, if we didn't have a whole lot of layers, we would do some damage. But we have a whole lot of layers that allow us to resist those abrasions. And we'll talk about how we constantly are replacing these upper layers with new cells as that occurs. The fancy word for layers of the skin are the strata. So that's the plural version. And then you'll see each individual layer we refer to as a stratum. So the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. And so that's going from superficial to deep. But you'll see our cells start here at the bottom and work their way up. And we'll talk about that a bit more. This word avascular means that we do not have a blood supply. So there's no blood vessels that penetrate into the epidermis. You see, we said the nerves and the vessels are down here in the dermal layer. And so our epidermis is going to rely on the dermis for all of its nutrients. So you don't need to memorize all five layers. We're going to highlight the two most important, or the two that we care about the most. And that's the very top, the most superficial, our stratum corneum, and the very bottom, our stratum basale. So our stratum corneum, like I just said, is our most superficial layer. And so these squamous cells are considered dead. I want you to take a look at our image here and see if you can kind of point out some of the characteristics in your head of what looks different between our top layers and our bottom layers. So if you noticed, one of the big things that our nucleus disappears, that's one big change in our feature, and our cells also flatten out a lot. And so the nucleus disappears because these top layer cells are now completely keratinized or completely filled with that protein keratin that makes them harder and protective and seals our water in. And so they're dead in a sense because if we don't have a nucleus, if we don't have our control center that helps us with cell division, then we can't keep dividing to make new cells. So these are the cells that are there to protect us against abrasions, and they will kind of get sloughed off or knocked off, and we'll replace them with the cells from layers underneath. On the opposite end, our deepest layer, the stratum basale, the important thing to note here is this is where mitosis occurs. So when the stratum basale cells divide, they split into two. Mitosis is our word for cell division. We're going to have one cell stay down here at the bottom layer so that it can keep making new cells. And one of the cells is going to get pushed up into the stratum spinosum. And so as we continue to divide and make new cells at the basal layer, we add more to the stratum spinosum. Those ones at the stratum spinosum keep filling with keratin and get pushed up, and so on and so forth. You guys should kind of get the idea there. And so you'll see this dividing line here is there just because that's where we see where that nuclei kind of drops out, and we're really getting fully keratinized. I guess one other layer that I'll say is a nice to know, maybe not a need to know, is the stratum lucidum. And so we have two types of skin in the body. We have thicker skin and we have thinner skin. Our thicker skin has all five layers. Our thinner skin only has four, and it's this stratum lucidum that kind of drops out of our thinner skin and that we add back in when we have thicker skin, like the palms of our hand or the soles of our feet. Moving down to the dermis, so we said our epidermis was stratified squamous cells. Our dermis is made up of connective tissue, and more specifically, dense connective tissue. We're going to have a few different types of cells. We have fibroblasts that are going to lay down some of that connective tissue. There are some adipocytes or some fat cells that creep up into the dermal layer. And there's also some macrophages, and macrophages are part of our immune system. Think if something gets through the protection of our epidermis and makes it into the dermal layer, it makes sense that we would want to have some security guards or our immune system cells there ready to prevent it from getting further into our system, especially because we have blood vessels there, which are kind of access to the rest of the body. Two types of protein fibers that we'll find are collagen fibers and elastic fibers. So collagen is our stronger protein. They're kind of like ropes. That's another one that's super common to see advertised for skin and hair products. And then elastic fibers do exactly what they're named for. They are elastic, meaning they're more resistant to stretch. We already said this earlier, but another reminder, this is where all of our blood vessels, nerves, glands, lymphatic vessels, a lot of our accessory structures. So we don't find much in that keratinized epidermal layer. We find it all in the dermal layer, and the nutrients are going to diffuse up into the epidermis. These hills here we refer to as the dermal papillae. And so that kind of allows our epidermis and dermis to fit together just like a puzzle piece. And so we don't want the two layers just sliding over top of each other. We want that to be a really strong connection. And so the dermal papillae help to form that layer. And this is actually what forms our handprints and footprints, or why everyone's is unique. So that's kind of a fun fact to take home with you. I'm going to go up one or a couple slides here just to point out that upper layer where we see those papillae, we refer to as the papillary layer. And most of our structures we find down here in the reticular layer. So the papillary layer with the papillae, that's our puzzle piece connection, helps the strength of the epidermal and dermal connection. And then we get down into the reticular layer where we have a lot more structures. So in the very beginning of our lecture here, we hinted that the color of our skin or the appearance of our integumentary system structures can give us a hint about what's going on from a diagnostic perspective. But of course, we have normal skin color changes that are affected primarily by the pigment melanin. So the pigment melanin is a brown to black pigment. Some have more of a yellow or red tone, so there's a few different variations of this. And so this is what is going to be primarily responsible for the color of skin, hair, and our eyes. Part of the reason we have melanin is that it provides protection against UV light. So you may say, if you remember from our vitamin D function, hey, wait, I thought we needed UV light to activate vitamin D. Yes, we do. We need some UV light, but there's some harmful rays, or if we get too much UV ray exposure, that can actually damage our nucleus and our DNA, and that can cause a big problem when it comes to cell division. So that's part of the reason why they recommend wearing sunscreen and not staying out in the sun too long, because if we get too much UV exposure, that's how stuff like skin cancer can form due to the changes or the damage that happens within the DNA that's housed in the nucleus. So, other reason why you get a tan when you lay out in the sun is that is your body responding to those UV rays and producing more melanin in an effort to provide more protection. So melanin is produced by melanocytes. So these are melanin producing cells, and this melanin transfers into our epithelial cells. So a lot of this is genetic. That's why we have our DNA structure here. So of course, with a tan, exposure to light is going to influence it, and there's some hormonal influence as well, but a lot of it is genetic. And it may be interesting to know that everybody has the same number of melanocytes, about the same number, but our variations in skin color are determined by how active that our melanocytes are and what kind or what variation we have in our melanocytes. Is it more of a brown black? Is it more of the yellow? Is it more of the red? And so we'll see that in people with a darker complexion, their melanocytes produce more melanin. So it's not that they have more melanocytes, those melanocytes are just more active. All right, a couple other pigments that uh, we talk about in relation to skin color or that contribute to skin color. The first one is hemoglobin. We'll talk about this one actually in an additional unit, in Unit 4, when we talk about the cardiovascular system, because it is really an oxygen carrying protein and pigment, but it's what makes our red blood cells red. So that's why I was saying someone that may show pallor or pale skin may be lacking hemoglobin. One of the very common diagnoses with that is anemia. And so if we have enough hemoglobin, our blood vessels in the dermis give that bit of a pink hue or reddish tone to the skin. Carotene is an easy one to remember because it's found in foods like carrots. So yellow-orange pigment. And so carotene, just like a carrot, it's going to accumulate actually in the lipids of the stratum corneum. If you remember, lipids is kind of a fancy way to say fat. Adipocytes are cells that store fat. And so these cells kind of soak up some of that carotene and give a little bit of a yellow-orange hue to our skin. If you eat a whole lot of carrots or foods that contain carotene, you can have a temporary look of even kind of a increased look of yellow and orange, but we're talking about large amounts, not you had some carrots as a snack and you turned orange. So protection was one of the big functions that we mentioned in the beginning. So we said it reduces our body, the loss of water from the body. So our keratinized layers of the epidermis act as a really good seal. This also acts as a good seal to keep things out. So microorganisms are things like bacteria, viruses, parasites, anything that we really don't want getting into the body. We talked about the importance of having so many layers because of how exposed our skin is. So we need to be able to protect the underlying structures of our blood vessels and nerves and important structures within the dermis from abrasion. And then we have that melanin that we just talked about that is going to help protect our nuclei from UV damage. Sensation was another big function that we mentioned. And so we have many receptors. Some are found within the epidermis, some are found within the dermis. And we're not going to go into every single type of receptor we have, but I do think it's important to make sure we understand that different types of sensations have different receptors. For example, pain has its own receptor. Heat and cold, temperature has its own receptor. Pressure has its own receptor. Even something sharp has its own receptor. Vibration has its own receptor. So we have receptors that are specific to the different sensations that we experience. One of our most sensitive receptors is actually associated with our hair follicle, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, at least the hair follicle itself. So that's partly why if you lightly brush your skin, don't even touch the skin, but just lightly brush over the hair on the body, you can actually detect that movement. All right, vitamin D synthesis. I said this is a kind of a domino effect. There's multiple steps in this process, and one of those first steps is that UV light is going to stimulate a precursor molecule of vitamin D. So it's not making vitamin D, it's kind of triggering a molecule that we need to activate vitamin D. So the reason vitamin D is so important to us is that it tells our small intestine to absorb calcium and phosphate. We're going to talk about our skeletal system. If we don't have calcium and phosphate, we can't make bone properly. So this is a super important vitamin. The precursor molecule that starts in our skin is going to actually travel to the liver where it goes through its next change, and then it actually travels to the kidneys before it goes through its next change and becomes the active version of vitamin D. The active version of vitamin D is called calcitriol. So if you see that word calcitriol, sounds like calcium, that is our active version of vitamin D. And calcitriol is what actually stimulates our small intestine to absorb calcium and phosphate. All right, temperature regulation is one of our kind of less intuitive functions of our integumentary system, but it's a super important function. If you remember back in Unit 1 when we talked about our negative feedback loops, we used temperature as one of our examples, and we're always trying to maintain that set point, that thermostat at 98.6 degrees. We only have a small window where our temperature can change and our body can still function properly. And that's because the enzymes and other chemical reactions that go on within the body all the time are used to running within that normal range around that set point of 98.6. Some things like exercise and fever, and obviously when it gets hotter outside, are going to raise body temperature. So we need a way to counteract that some so that we can keep the body functioning normally. So remember, we're always trying to maintain homeostasis. So this is kind of a partnership between our cardiovascular system and our integumentary system. So our arteries especially have smooth muscle within them that allows them to dilate, which means widen, or constrict, meaning get more narrow. So just to kind of make sure we're on the same page, this is our skin on this side. So this would be the superficial side. This is our environment. Here's our deeper portion. So this is farther into the dermis and farther into the body. So if we need to dissipate, if we need to remove heat, we can dilate or widen these surface vessels, and some of that heat that's contained within our body is going to be released across the epidermis. So most of the time, we're in an environment that is less than 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we bring that blood that's around 98.6 degrees to the surface, it's going to release that heat and cool us down some. Another mechanism for cooling us down is sweating. And so when sweat goes on our skin and evaporates, that also helps us cool down. And we'll talk about sweat glands a bit later. Vice versa, if we want to maintain or retain that heat, then we can vasoconstrict our surface arteries and we're going to keep most of that blood deeper in the surface. That means less heat is going to be lost across the epidermis. Shivering obviously is another way that we can promote heat. That's not so much our integumentary system, but that's really our muscular system that is starting to contribute to that. Okay, moving on to hair. So, like I said, try to remember that the integumentary system is not just our skin. That's our primary organ, but all the accessory structures contribute as well. So that includes both hair and nails. And we find hair everywhere on the skin except the palms of the hands, the soles of our feet, the bottom of the feet, our lips, the nipples, some parts of the genitalia, and then certain distal segments of the fingers and the toes. So once we get all the way towards the end of our fingers and toes, we don't find as much hair. The hair on our head acts as a heat insulator, which means it helps us keep heat in, and it's also protection from the sun. eyebrows keep sweat out of our eyes, and they actually kind of act as an umbrella or an awning, some shade for our eyes. We, unless you've shaved your eyebrows off, you probably haven't noticed this, but if you were to get rid of your eyebrows, the world would look a lot brighter because they do help protect our eyes some from the sun, and they also help keep sweat out of our eyes. Eyelashes are designed to protect our eye from foreign objects. It's another layer of protection. And I kind of always thought it was funny that getting an eyelash in your eye is one of the worst feelings, and they're designed to keep things out of the eye. So sometimes we work against ourselves. We also find hair in the nose as well as our ears. So there's an entryway into the body for both the nose and the ears. So that helps keep things like dust and pollen and other foreign objects that we don't want to make it into our system. And we're going to go through all these pieces of the hair here soon. So a hair follicle is actually an invagination, a pocket of our epidermis, which extends deep down into the dermis. Within our hair follicle, we're going to find the hair root, which is below the surface of the skin, and the hair shaft, which is above the surface of the skin. So keep in mind, the hair follicle is not part of the hair itself. That is kind of the pocket that our hair is located in. So the bulb is at the very bottom. So B for bulb, B for bottom. So this is where our hair is going to grow. It, anything below the surface of the skin is the root, just like the roots of a plant. And then the shaft is above the surface. Our hairs all have a little tiny smooth muscle called the erector pili muscle that's attached to the follicle. And that's what actually makes our hair stand on end. That's the muscle responsible for goosebumps. So if we zoom in on our hair bulb, you'll see we have the follicle itself that surrounds it. The very middle we call the medulla. So M for medulla, M for middle. There's a cortex that surrounds that softer middle or medulla. And then our cortex is actually covered by a cuticle. So we have the cortex, the medulla, and the cuticle. So the cuticle is a single layer of cells, and it's really what's helping our hair maintain its position within our hair follicle. We said B for bulb, B for bottom. This is where our hair actually grows. So this is where the hair is going to rest on a hair papilla. So we saw the word papilla earlier in the dermis. This is a hair papilla, and we have blood vessels that go into this papilla and supply the bulb of our hair with nutrients so that it can grow. Our next accessory structure that we'll talk about is the nails. And so the nail is really a thin plate of specialized stratum corneum cells. And so the cells themselves are just like our other stratum corneum cells. It's the special extra protective and hard type of keratin that fills them that makes them our nails. And so, of course, this protects the tips of our fingers and toes. And it also, of course, can be used in defense for protection, and it does help us with grip as well. You can dig your nails in. Just like our hair, we'll go over a couple of important parts. So the visible part, the more majority of what we consider our nail is called the nail body. The portion of the nail that we cut is known as the free edge. And this smaller white portion here is known as the lunula. So I always think it looks like a half moon, like Luna for moon, the lunula. The cuticle is also known as the eponychium. It's fine to just remember cuticle. And so this is actually part of our stratum corneum of the epidermis that extends onto the nail body. If you remember, our cuticle within the hair follicle helped hold it in place. Same idea with our nail. That cuticle is helping to maintain our nail in that position. Underneath our nail body is the nail bed. And so we have a lot of blood vessels that extend into this nail bed, and it actually diffuses and nourishes the nail body as well. So if you kind of squeeze the tip of your nail hard and then let go, you'll see it got pale and then it gets red again. That's the blood vessels kind of getting supplied with blood again after being compressed. We have a nail root under the skin, so just like our hair root. And then we have the nail matrix actually surrounds our nail root. And this is kind of comparable to our hair bulb. So this is where our nail is actually growing from and then extending outward. Like I said, the lunula is this kind of half moon shaped part, the lighter color of the nail right above the cuticle. And we can see the nail matrix through the nail body. So that's why it has a little different covering or coloring, excuse me, I misspoke, to our nail body. Okay, our last accessory structures that we haven't talked about yet are the glands. And so we have a few different types of glands we're going to talk about. The first is a sebaceous gland, which is more commonly known as an oil gland, and these are associated with a hair follicle. So that's one easy way you can tell you're looking at a sebaceous gland versus a sweat gland is because that sebaceous gland is going to be connected to the hair or the hair follicle to be more specific. So two structures that are associated with our hair follicle are our rector pili muscle that makes our hair stand on end and our sebaceous slash oil gland. And so sebaceous glands secrete a substance called sebum. And so that's an oily substance. That's why they're more commonly known as oil glands, rich in fats. And that's going to travel up the hair follicle onto the surface of our skin. It helps lubricate the hair itself as well as our skin, so it prevents our skin from drying out. And it has a little bit of a protective function. It makes it a little tougher for bacteria and some other microorganisms to actually stay on the skin or get through that sebum. When it comes to sweat glands, we have two different types. The first one we're going to talk about is more common. This is our eccrine sweat gland. And these are what when we say we produce sweat, we're really talking about our eccrine glands. And so sweat, for the most part, is water mixed with some different salts. And so our eccrine glands don't attach to the hair follicle. They have their own exit to the surface, and so these are considered exocrine glands. So all of our glands are considered exocrine glands because they don't go into the bloodstream. They go through a duct or a channel to get to where they're going. So our sebaceous gland has to go through the hair follicle. Our eccrine gland has its own pathway, but they're going through a duct or a channel. They're not going into the bloodstream. So these are exocrine, not endocrine. We'll bring that up in a few different units. We talked about sweat already when we discussed thermal regulation. So sweat lands on the surface of our skin and then it evaporates and that helps cool us down. Sweat is also a stress response, especially in areas like the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, your armpits. Your eccrine sweat glands are the reason why Eminem's palms were sweaty during 8 Mile. And so we find these almost everywhere in the skin, but we have a lot of these within the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. Our other type of sweat gland is known as an apocrine gland. And so these are different than our eccrine glands. They're a bit more unique because they produce a thicker secretion that has a lot more substances dissolved in it. And so these do open onto our hair follicle. So you'll see our eccrine glands go up to the surface by themselves. The apocrine gland has its own initial kind of duct or tunnel, but it's going to connect to our hair follicle before it gets to the surface. So these are primarily found in the armpits and genitalia, and they don't become active until puberty, and that's because they're activated by the influence of our sex hormones. The secretion itself is odorless, But once it gets onto the surface of our skin, it starts to be broken down by bacteria, and that's what actually creates body odor or BO. So we're getting to the end here. This is our last slide, but one thing I wanted to point out, this is a really good cross section to look at in terms of keeping track of all the different pieces that we find within the integumentary system. So you should be able to look at this cross section and label your different layers in terms of epidermis, dermis, and our subcutaneous tissue. You should be able to point out which glands are which. You can tell our apocrine is going to go up to the hair follicle. Our sebaceous gland is connected right to the hair follicle. And then our eccrine gland is the one hanging out by itself. We have our erector pili muscle associated with the hair follicle, and we have our blood vessels down here in the dermal layer. So make sure you not only understand what the role or job of all of our different structures are, but when you're actually looking at a cross section of the skin, what can you actually point out? What can you label? So that wraps up our first body system, and we will keep going, and I'll see you in chapter 6.